Hello and welcome to this video on how the God Emperor's finest warriors, the Space Marines, or Astartes depending on whether you want to stick to the original name or the copyrightable name Games Workshop insists on, are made. For this video, Astartes is easier, and given how many times we will be coming back to it and need to say that word, we're going to use it instead. An Astartes is the elite warrior of humankind from the 30th to 41st millennium. After this, the Primaris Marines came into being through the powers of a warp squirrel, but we're not going to touch that debacle in this video. Just know that much of the same process is used for Primaris Marines as for regular Astartes. The Astartes are genetically and physically augmented humans of a kind. Each is made by taking an adolescent human male who has survived the aspirant trials and implanting 19 different organs known as gene seed into their body over the following 4 to 8 years. The survival rate among aspirants who seek to enter the chapter, the neophytes who are accepted and receive training, and finally those receiving the gene of their chapter's founder, are low. Very low. The collective benefit of the gene seed is to improve the aspirant and develop them into a lean, mean killing machine of righteous empirical fury, death to the alien, mutant, and heretic. These organs are implanted into the brain, circulatory system, gastric system, and musculoskeletal system, along with being standalone organs. As mentioned, the gene seed is derived from the chapter's founding Primarch. This both provides the benefits of the desired growth and physical improvement, but it may also carry defects and demerits in behavior, physiology, and mentality. Each founding Primarch has their history mutations and traits. These will often, if not always, be carried through to successor Astartes chapter members. The gene seed and other implants will allow the Astartes to be a much greater warrior, but also interact with their armor and equipment at a much greater depth of understanding and implementation than any regular human is capable of. Young males between the ages of 10 and 14 are chosen based on their ability to grow into the new organs, respond to the drugs and hormones used, and hopefully not die as often. This is still a very risky operation, and the success rates are small. The issues are many-fold, but to start with, they use growth hormones, things like testosterone for instance, as well as human growth hormone. These are often also at greater concentrations in males, and so you will choose a male in the first place. Then you need to look at the hormones that are involved trying to increase their prevalence in the body anyway. Generally speaking, if you want to increase the expression, you'll find that most female sex hormones will downregulate that. So, this is why males are selected to start with. Not only are they selected for that basis, but the number of females who would get through the trials required to get to the neophyte stage are already an issue. Once you get to the point where you're going to start looking to make an Astartes, it's not just a matter of finding an acceptable aspirant to turn into a neophyte. The first thing you need is a surviving Astartes, or at least access to existing gene seed stocks from a chapter's home base, or even the Mage's Biologus. Once the seed is sourced, either surgically from a veteran or battlefield casualty, it's used to grow the gene seed organs. Once you have both gene seed and can administer it through the actions of an apothecary, you move on to the neophyte themselves, or at least before this they'll be an aspirant. The apothecary will now need to choose a suitable aspirant. Each chapter uses its own criteria and methods for this. As it is as diverse as the number of chapters, we'll forgo the details but understand each chapter will choose an aspirant to turn into a neophyte. What is important is that they are just hitting adolescence. This is because once accepted, they'll be given growth hormones amongst other things. This is going to cause them to start to grow. Each Astartes is between 2.1 and 2.3 meters in height, or about 7.5 feet. Other than height, the aspirant is also honed with combat experience, muscle mass, knowledge of the battlefield, tactics, and more. All of this while growing as naturally as possible with regards to the normal development of a male, such as growth spurts exhibited during puberty. Unlike most males during puberty, however, they will be going through what is effectively a war to develop them into a lean, mean killing machine. Puberty also has the advantage that it means their body will grow, and as the abilities to control it will also grow. Imagine a child learning to walk. They take time to understand their own bodies. What will happen to the neophyte is very similar, as each gene seed organ causes their body to act differently, and they need to come to grips with these changes. And there will be many times where they need to rebalance their body, get used to how things work again, and figure out how to do basic actions. A fully grown adult will have a great deal more trouble, if not be completely unable to adapt. And again, this is why they generally choose adolescent males. By accepting teens into the chapter for training, they can also be adapted to a lifetime of service they'll be undergoing. This is not a normal lifetime of about 80 years, but possibly many centuries of service in which they basically exist to constantly engage in battle. A youth is more likely to be able to adapt mentally and physically to these changes and those created by the gene seed implants. Worse yet, if they are honoured by becoming a dreadnought. This involves entombing the honoured Astartes before death, but very near to it, in a sarcophagi that will sustain their life for possibly millennia, and forever deny them the release of death until the mechanical body is destroyed. Assuming the aspirant has survived to the point where they are undergoing gene seed implants, the first thing to happen is a range of organs and neural implants. These can be done piecemeal or all at once. This first stage will also establish the immunogenetic compatibility of the aspirant and gene seed. If there is no compatibility, then the recipient will die, just as with any grafted tissue or organ. All of the known primarchs are male, and this is yet another reason why it's unlikely a female aspirant would be chosen to become a neophyte. Remember that while the neophyte undergoes this process of implantation, they are also likely to see combat directly as part of the scout company in some chapters, or this may be delayed into a stage where there's more of the implants completed than not. For this reason, neophyte and scout marine are used, but we'll continue with neophyte as it indicates that they are not yet full battle brothers or full Astartes, nor are they truly human anymore. The first thing they receive is a secondary heart. This is a complex surgery, but also involves some of the most simple things. The hard part is grafting the second heart into the circulatory system and syncing it with the other heart, so as not to prevent each from beating as needed. Each heart expands as it fills with blood. It then contracts to push the blood out. By having each fill while the other contracts ensures each heart can fill to its capacity and not be blocked by the lungs or other heart. This secondary heart is smaller than the primary heart, and it makes it somewhat easier than if it was a full-sized heart. Despite that, it is still a consideration you need to be aware of. Despite being smaller, it must be able to sustain the same amount of blood that flows through the body as the normal primary heart moves when it is at rest. This means that there is always a minimum level of, let's say, biological viability for the Astartes, no matter how badly injured their primary heart is. It will also need to be attached to the arteries and veins. Normally, there is just one way for blood to re-enter the heart and leave to go around the body. There is one way for it to leave the heart and return from the lungs with oxygen. Now you have two hearts. Each will need valves, arteries and veins to ensure blood only flows one way. Without this, blood would flow back into the heart, and you get blood sitting in the heart, clotting and eventually killing the Astartes. The implanted secondary heart needs to be hooked into the existing arteries and veins, specifically here thinking of the aorta and vena cava, to ensure that blood will go back into the heart and out again as needed. Secondary to this is the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary artery. The second gene seed implant is why youth are needed in particular. It is an organ that causes the young aspirant come neophyte to grow much larger and stronger than a normal human. This organ is called the osmodula. This is implanted into the neophyte and it's near the pituitary. The pituitary is where most of the human body's hormones are either produced directly or regulated for the purposes of growth and development. Being located here, it interfaces with the endocrine or hormone system of the body. This allows the implant to increase the production of growth hormones, steroids, calcitonin, and more that increase the size, muscle mass, bone density, and more of the Astartes neophyte. This is further supported by adding trace amounts of minerals and other supplements to the neophyte's diet. This helps to synthesize the rapid growth of an Astartes skeletal-muscular system, and they will need this. It's needed to support the increased muscle mass to start with. This is further strengthened by both the Astartes armor, which has a sort of internal membrane and muscle, and later also muscle augmentation. Without strengthening and increasing the size of the Astartes bone, it would break like chicken bones under the excess stress of the muscles moving of their own accord. This is why they need to supplement them so heavily and ensure their growth. While the bone mass increases, it will also lead to changes in the rib cage. This is part of the Astartes body, which permanently expands. It expands and fuses together into a solid bone mass around the thorax. The increased thoracic volume is needed in order to ensure the lungs can expand and that they, along with the other various organs put into the thorax, fit in the first place. Fusing the rib cage places greater weight and effort on the diaphragm to move air into the lungs and out, as normally the intercostal muscles will pull on the rib cage, raising it to bring air in and allow it to fall, therefore pushing air out. Since this is no longer an option, given that the rib cage is solid, you now rely solely on the diaphragm to increase thoracic volume, and that's going to be a necessary part of this, and so, along with the increase in the muscle mass of everything else, the diaphragm is also going to have to increase its strength. This does have a benefit. It provides integral armor plate to the chest cavity and the essential organs found within. The next gene seed of interest is the biscopia. This is another hormone-producing organ, but this is put into the chest cavity, which is getting very full and crowded, but fortunately this particular organoid is very small. It is normally implanted sometime between the 10th and 12th year of life for the neophyte. Like the osmedulla, it is involved in producing more growth hormone-like results. Unlike the other hormones, this will target specifically the muscle cell size, which seems somewhat counterproductive. The biscopia is meant to lead to muscle hypertrophy. This has a higher chance of causing muscle weakness, while it increases the size, so it may look impressive but not necessarily be impressive. If instead it increases muscle mass and density, it would increase strength. This would require both more myocytes or muscle cells, but also that they get slightly larger. A combination gives both short-term strength and longer-term strength and endurance. This is going to include a much larger percentage of slow twitch or type 1 muscle fibers. These are the hard-working, long-lasting muscle fibers found, for instance, in the back of your legs and the back of your chest. While these are not as effective in sudden bursts of activity, they are more capable of using both energy and oxygen, which has been made more available through the introduction of the secondary heart. The hemostamen we'll describe later. The lack of efficiency is made up for by increasing density and volume of these muscle fibers. It might also be possible that it increases the prevalence of the intermediate type 1 fibers. These are very much like the normal type 1 fibers, but they are somewhat hybridized with type 2. Type 2 fibers are much better at short bursts of incredible physical activity. However, the hybridized version is good at that while being able to use energy and oxygen, something type 2 doesn't do as much as they rely primarily on anaerobic processes. This means that the Astartes would have a much more reliable source of physical strength and be able to put out a lot of short-term but high-power strength. The next major gene seed organ is the hemostamen or blood maker organ. This is less about blood and more to do with blood function. It creates a better transfer of oxygen and nutrition into the body, and this also helps with metabolism, specifically removing waste from metabolism. This organ can be found in several places, including the aorta, femoral arteries, and vena cava. It is implanted somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14 years. To both carry greater oxygen, or at least improve oxygen transfer capacity, this organ would need to make a number of changes, either biochemical or direct changes to the way the body operates. These include increased CO2 concentrations in blood when giving oxygen to the tissues, or much less CO2 when trying to dissolve oxygen into the blood. The blood would need a higher acid concentration to increase oxygen absorption into the blood, and specifically binding to hemoglobin. Finally, higher temperature. The hotter the body, the more affinity oxygen has for hemoglobin. It makes sense then that if you were to change, say, the lungs, where there was a shift in the isoelectric point of the area there that allowed the hemoglobin to more readily absorb the oxygen, but once it was out of the lungs, it had a reduced affinity, you would get more oxygen binding in the lungs to hemoglobin, and you might find that there's something to this effect happening. This also assumes that the hemostatin does not modify the hemoglobulin itself. Hemoglobulin or hemoglobin is made with 4 heme or iron molecules in a protein mesh. These are what hold on to oxygen, either improving the number of iron molecules or the affinity of the iron for more oxygen through altering the hemoglobin. You would increase oxygen carrying capacity. This means you don't need to worry about the isoelectric point or other changes we've mentioned already. Rather, you could simply improve the ability of the red blood cell to do its job. Another option would be to replace some of this function by making it so the oxygen can either be dissolved in the plasma much more readily, which already does happen to some extent, or you could do something along the lines of improving nutrition carrying capacity. And this can be achieved by the addition of other proteins, particularly carrier molecules such as that used for lipids called lipoproteins, but with a focus on nutrients, oxygen, and waste. This removes the need to dissolve it in plasma, but instead does require an increase in products in the blood that would specifically do this job. Think of something like a special red blood cell dedicated to CO2. You have another one specially dedicated to oxygen, and something else dedicated to waste or nutrients. Interestingly, the organs we've just mentioned all interact with the osmogola and the biscopia, and in doing so, it's regulated to some extent. As for the location, this makes a lot of sense, as it can monitor the activities of these gene seed organs throughout the body, since blood will always flow past these organs and locations. This means there's constant feedback to moderate what's going on in the body. If there is a sudden, unexpected, and very negative response, the organs can slow down the activity and therefore, hopefully, improve the neophyte's chances of survival, which are already pretty low. The 5th gene seed organ is the Larraman's organ. This is implanted when they are between 12 and 14. This is an essential organ for any Astartes, as it greatly increases their capacity to heal injuries, particularly since they will be sustaining many injuries that would most likely kill any normal human. The Larraman's organ is a small collection of cells, roughly 4 centimeters or 1.5 inches. The structure looks kind of like the liver, but does not have anywhere near the same functions at all, while being in the thoracic cavity. So it's an odd analogy to draw on the part of Games Workshop, but it is what it is. These cells help the body deal with injuries by producing clotting factors and platelets. These are released when the vascular system sends a distress signal, such as massive blood loss. This leads to the clotting cascade kicking into overdrive and sealing the wound site. The platelets follow the normal clotting cascade, and details can be found in the top right corner of this video, where you see how to stop the clotting cascade and what's involved. This is followed by Larraman cells themselves, released from the organ going to the injury site, and both synthesizing and depositing collagen to create scar tissue in moments. These are sent on a one-way trip and so can be very productive for a very short period of time, and then die like leukocytes. In fact, it's more like leukocytes which release granules, except in this instance it's collagen and other connective tissues, that, after the platelets initially plug the wound, provide an actual connective tissue layer that will back this and ensure, at least temporarily, it's sealed to some extent. This process will also need to release signals to cells in the area to both proliferate to fill in the wound site, but also to create a chemoattractant for fibroblasts. These are needed to get the scar tissue to settle and solidify. The combination of both platelets and scarring is possible, but the area must not be hemostatically stable, as the scar tissue would not be strong. It takes time for scar tissue to stabilize. Further, the scar tissue contains no elastic tissue, which makes it unable to stretch. This reduces the range of motion from large scars. This leads to scars, and especially large scars, tearing more easily than epithelium or skin does, or established scar tissue. This should also increase the fever response of an Astartes, as it will improve immunological response, improve metabolism for healing, and increase the activities that heal the Astartes themselves, both short-term and somewhat longer-term. The next gene seed organ is implanted after the Larraman's organ, sometime between 14 and 17 years. This is also done while the neophyte begins hypnotherapy to learn how to use their equipment. The organ is called the catalepsion node, a rather more practical replacement for caffeine and other drugs used to ward off sleep. It can be found just above the brainstem. It directly interfaces with the stress response of the Astartes. The brainstem is responsible for very basic behaviors like breathing and other fundamental actions of the body that keep you from dying. When there is a spike in the activities in that part of the brain, it can turn off the catalepsion node, and this will help to solve the issue of the Astartes being fatigued. The way it works is that it shuts down brain activity in parts of the brain that are not needed at that time. These can be selected at will by the Astartes. This leaves the Astartes still conscious, aware, and active while resting part of their brain. By turning off the catalepsion node, you then have those parts of the brain come back online, and you regain all function. By no means is this a substitute for sleep, however, just the same way that energy drinks, coffee, or caffeine pills are not a substitute for sleep. As with any human, or superhuman in the case of an Astartes, the lack of sleep does eventually lead to the brain throwing errors. This can be seen in the form of hallucinations, psychoses, and other mental conditions. This organ just delays them somewhat. The problem is how the organ knows which parts to turn off from the brainstem and how to do so without interfering with the Astartes' bodily function. For example, if you interfere with anything in the area of the motor or sensory cortex, you will either not be able to move or feel, or at best have a significantly delayed response to these signals. Further, much of the brain is interconnected. You need to link 4 discrete areas for speech: Werner's area, Broca's area, the motor cortex, and sensory cortex. If you interfere with any one of these, it doesn't matter that you have the other 3 working just fine, you may not be able to speak. It has been compared to dolphins' ability to switch off half of their brains, but this is a whole hemisphere, not a selective region. It would need to either directly interfere with neural activity by decreasing the voltage of the area around neurons, or by directly inhibiting neuropeptides and neurosignals that would turn these neurons on and generate activity. After the catalepsion node is implanted, the following 3 organs are generally implanted at the same time or very close to each other between the ages of 14 and 16. The preumnor, the omophagia, and the multilung. The preumnor is a weird but useful organ that functions as a sort of secondary stomach after the normal human stomach. It is somewhat similar to how a cow has sequential stomachs, but in this case it both breaks down otherwise inedible matter, but also handles some of the poisonous content of an edible but deadly matter. It would have to be a neuron-rich organ with many sensory nerve endings projecting into the stomach after the material is broken down. This is what would allow the organ to have both a neutralizing effect and, to a certain extent, why it would be called the neutralizer. It also has the ability to analyze the contents of the preumnor biochemically. In doing so, it would be able to isolate the most dangerous or poisonous elements from the rest of the Astartes' body. Once you have isolated these parts, it can expel them, or, alternatively, instead of expelling them through vomiting, it can move them to the Becher's gland, which is another gene seed organ we'll describe later in this video. The preumnor acts very much like a combination of tongue, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. It metabolizes products and analyzes them. This allows it to use them for other purposes. For instance, the liver can detox the body and put lipids and more into the gallbladder, where, along with bile salts, they form bile. Bile is then used in the body for breaking down lipids again, breaking down proteins and more. The pancreas has a similar role, but it also neutralizes the gastric juices from the stomach, and this means you do not have gastric acid or stomach acid entering the intestines, where it would melt you from the inside out. In that respect, everything kind of works, but it is a question about how it is cut off from the rest of the GI tract. Is the preomnor a bypassed organ, or is it in line with the stomach? Could the preomnor be a sort of closed loop, sorts anyway, where whatever is absorbed right after the stomach is either deposited into the preomnor first before passing through to the duodenum, thereby allowing it to be processed and have anything undesired removed, or is it perhaps possibly part of the duodenum, where it normally acts as a means of further breaking down contents and neutralizing stomach acid, or detoxifying the body if needed before passing directly to the duodenum? The next organ implanted into the Astartes while their abdomen is open is the omophagia. It also involves a number of other parts of the body as well. It should directly link the spinal cord, stomach, and brain. This is an organ that lets an individual Astartes experience some of the food source's life and memories. There are also 4 new nerve bundles implanted that connect the spine and the stomach wall. This would likely link to the sensory nerves we've mentioned used for the preomnor. This is a very specialized organ of sorts, and it's implanted between the thoracic vertebrae and the stomach wall. It's meant to absorb information from DNA, RNA, or protein that contains experiences or memories. Although this seems rather unlikely to be the way it actually works. Given the lack of understanding in the 41st millennium, the explanation may be the best available, but not an actual description of what it does. A somewhat more realistic explanation is that this organ has some capacity to build a profile of the contents of the content eaten. This allows it to extrapolate meaning from the food. For example, a very lean and dry food which lacks certain vitamins or minerals may indicate starvation. A prion disease, cannibalism. The presence of noxious or poisonous substances that the thing died from, poisoning. These are seemingly more realistic, but not necessarily the whole story either. This could also explain not just the local implants, but direct interfacing with the brain if it is the case. If it is directly interfacing with the brain, it could draw on greater memories and processing capabilities, allowing it to link different parts of what's going on in the food with the experiences of the Astartes and the processing power of the brain, allowing them to extrapolate far more meaning out of these samples. The last organ implanted, so to speak, while the neophyte is being operated on in this situation is the multilung. This is a third lung placed in the Astartes' already very crowded chest cavity. This lung is somewhat unique in that it both provides a means of increasing air take in a low oxygen environment, but also as a source of filtered air in hazardous environments. The latter is achieved by a sphincter which either opens the third lung to get air in, or closes off the other normal lungs to direct air only into the multilung. The lung itself has the ability to filter out dangerous gases. This would need to be done by having a much more specialized set of cells that allow a very limited material to pass through than what you find in the lungs normally. Where a normal alveoli or lung gas exchange unit is just one membrane thick between the gas and the bloodstream, this would need to be somewhat thicker, or you would need to have multiple layers of filtration through these cells. This is needed to keep both water and toxins out of the Astartes, but also to allow them to breathe in water as the multilung is said to do. In this case, having a thicker membrane either made up of several cells or several progressive filtration units, where you have contents filtered out in between, it would allow for the concentration of oxygen. In water, there are between 4 and 8 parts per million of oxygen. Normal air has 200,000 parts per million. Now, this is not necessarily as big a problem as you might think, as the vast majority of oxygen you breathe in, you also breathe out. This means that having a much lower amount of oxygen, if you can extract it, is going to work. By having many smaller, more concentrated pockets of alveoli or alveoli-like filtration units within the lungs, you can therefore try and extract as much of the oxygen out of the water as possible. This is the same idea fish have with gills, where the gills are very thin and the water passes over, allowing the oxygen to be drawn out. The challenge will be removing toxins. If you do what fish do with gills and just try to have a very thin surface area with lots of surface area, you can pull in everything, but you don't filter out anything either, and this can lead to poisoning in this case. The challenge will be, how do you concentrate the oxygen and filter? One possibility is that the oxygen-saturated plasma fluid from the initial absorption can be shuffled around the body in such a way, and particularly within the multi-lung, where the multi-lung allows for the oxygen alone to be picked up by red blood cells who have a specific affinity for it, while the rest of the content gets exhaled. The alternative to this is that by concentrating the oxygen and not allowing any other gases to pass through, it could get dissolved in plasma where red blood cells could pick it up later. About a year after the last gene seed organs were implanted, the oculobe is performed. The neophyte will be between 14 and 16 at this time. This implant sits at the base of the brain after being implanted along the optic nerve and connected to the retina. It provides both hormonal and genetic stimuli. This is important for a Astartes' eyes, particularly the therapy they will go through. All neophytes will undergo both the training and the implants in the apothecarium. Both the nerve and eye itself will be permanently changed by this, and one key is that the nerve is both sensitized to light, and this allows it to better transmit messages along its length more freely. The eye itself also has a much greater abundance of light receptor cells develop. This increases both low and normal light vision ability. Further to the two typical cells, otherwise called rods and cones, there is a third cell type that will proliferate, the retinal ganglion cells. These help to increase and refine the pupillary reflexes that allow the retina to contract and dilate in response to light conditions. Collectively, these changes give the Astartes near unparalleled vision in nearly all conditions. This ranges from pitch black to the brightest of days, with very little loss of function at either end or in the middle. Once the neophyte has adapted to their new eyes, they will move on to receiving the liman's ear. This is a structure that both protects the Astartes from the effects of vertigo, dizziness, and other sense of balance issues, but it's also able to filter out noise and allow them to specifically hear what's going on around them. The liman's ear is a complete replacement for one of the Space Marine's original ears. The implantation of a physical new ear allows for all kinds of adaptations and changes. The most likely changes to result from the liman's ear are that they either alter to or add membranes to the inner part of the ear with more discrete ranges of impotence, or they act on each of the bones in the ear responsible for sound perception. This would more effectively break down and filter out sounds, thereby allowing for greater selectivity than our grandfather has when grandma is complaining. This would improve the cochlear's ability to respond to the outside signals, more so if more than one cochlea is present. If each of the broad sound ranges is broken down into its own set of signals for the cochlea, and the hairs within this let the brain receive a stronger signal for each discrete type of sound, you would have better acuity of hearing. This would allow the cochlea area to become a structure in its own right. You would have 3 discrete cochleas, so to speak. That in turn means it responds to only lower-pitched, higher-pitched, or mid-pitched tones. At present, the normal human cochlea is made up of one unit that has a progressive change between these 3. It's also likely that the cells in the ear are likely more responsive to the ions within, that is, the hairs within the cochlea themselves. This preemptively primes them to respond to less input from the environment. That means softer or lighter sounds can be heard from further away. The beneficial balance changes can be, at least in part, achieved by increasing the viscosity of the fluid in the ventricles of the ears, and this would need to be in both ears. This will reduce the sensation of changing location while not altering the sense of direction of the eye tracking ability. This means that there is no net loss in ability to engage with the environment while not getting anywhere near shaken up or experiencing vertigo. Up to a year after Lyman's ear is implanted, the Astartes neophyte will receive the sus and membrane. This is performed only once the neophyte has reached between 15 and 16 years of age, as it is a direct neural implant that requires both follow-up procedures to ensure function and development along with training. The sus and membrane is a very specialized bit of kit. It is a genetically engineered neural tissue that over time will merge with the Astartes neophyte cerebrum. Its role will be to place the Astartes into suspended animation if they get extremely injured during battle, or if the Astartes has a will to do so. Functionally, it shuts down basically all of the biological and psychic functions of the Astartes in battle once they're finished or at this stage in neophyte. The heart slows down and basically stops. Nearly all metabolic activity will end, neurons stop firing, muscles and neurons cease to do much of anything. There's also the release of a signal that will try and kill any bacterium via an electrical pulse. This would have to be done by the release of stress hormones specifically made to reduce metabolic, neurological, and cell-based activity, along with interfacing with the armor of the Astartes. The closing of channels for ions, as an example, would prevent neurons, muscle cells, and more from functioning, but not necessarily kill them. It may also release a signal to reduce, if not outright halt, gene expression temporarily. The appropriate chemical therapies or autosuggestion can bring the Astartes back from this state of suspended animation, but it's also possible that the Astartes themselves can initiate it if their body senses they are in an environment which is livable to say the least. The process will take a number of days. The delay is that so no single process can be just turned back on. The reality is the body can't just turn on a switch. It takes time to progressively reactivate gene expression, reopen channels, and return the body to a state of, at least mostly, function once more. Further, sudden changes in the blood chemistry, particularly concentrations of ions, glucose, and more, can kill. This is why it needs to be gradually achieved, just as it would with starvation. The rest of the body's functions are exactly the same. They need to happen slowly but surely. The 13th gene seed organ implanted into a neophyte is the melanochrome. This is a hormonal implant and attached to the lymphatic system, so most likely lymph nodes. It has one job. It controls the amount of melanin that is being put into an Astartes skin. The idea here is that if you are exposed to sunlight, and that's going to cause damage, your skin will darken over time to compensate. If it doesn't, you'll get sunburn, and the Astartes is no exception to this rule, and in fact it can respond to other forms of radiation as well. This does mean that what the Astartes gets is really just an exaggerated version of the normal melanocyte function, but by having a dedicated organ take over, it can respond more rapidly. It also has more ability to store and specialize materials for this reaction. By having a specialized organ, you will also be more responsive to things like acetylcholine and melanocyte-stimulating hormone. These can also be increased by the hemostaben organ, which would detect damage to the body, the oolitic kidney, which would be removing the damaged material, and the osmodola, which is responsible for hormone release. This will overall improve the production of hormones, or releasing hormones, to increase responses to things like UV radiation, rather than being burned, and it may explain why some chapters have issues in how they either respond or do not respond to things like UV radiation. The next two gene seed organs may be transplanted during the same procedure or spread out between the ages of 15 and 16 years. The first of these organs is the oolitic kidney. This organ is implanted in the abdominal cavity, and it should act as part of the Astartes' normal excretory system, but it also has a role to play in emergencies, specifically detoxifying the body and therefore allowing the Astartes to survive exposure to extremely harsh environmental hazards or deliberate poisoning. Think of things like touching or exposure to drugs, ingestion of poisons, nergal gases. The list could go on. The problem is that if the iliac kidney has to act and do its job on a extreme basis because of exposure to this, normally the body of the Astartes basically shuts down. They can't function while the iliac kidney is doing its job on a larger scale, so to say. For the iliac kidney to function, it must have both much more dense and much more vascularized nephrons. These are the units in the kidney that filter the plasma, or more accurately filtrate, and remove waste material. For this to work, it would need to closely work with or share functions with the liver. The liver would metabolize the noxious contents of the body, which is then immediately moved to the iliac kidney. It is possible for the iliac kidney to be separate from the normal kidneys and only activated when the right signals are received, and this would allow the iliac kidney to recover between bouts of intoxication. By increasing the number and density of nephrons along with the vascular vessels to draw away the needed content and direct waste into urine, the iliac kidney would be able to more effectively filter. It would still need a very robust system of ion channels in the first region of the nephron. This would leave only waste in the latter part of the nephron and minimize reabsorption of toxins. You would also need to look at how it draws out water, leaving only toxic material, and therefore creating a very nasty urine product. However, this detoxification process will render the Astartes unconscious once it begins, and so it is dangerous, particularly if it's done when fighting, for example, Nurgle's Marines. The Plague God is not exactly known for playing fair. Under normal conditions, or at least circumstances, the iliac kidney should also act as something of a regulatory organ, primarily thinking here of the circulatory system and blood volume. The fact is that with 2 hearts, a 3rd lung, and a much larger body, the Astartes needs as much blood flow going as often and as reliably as possible. The fact that it draws very much on ions to force toxic compounds to be drawn into the urine and ducts that it collects within would explain why the Astartes would lose function if this entire system has to kick in. The reason for this is relatively straightforward. They direct much of the body's energy to the ion channels and much of the blood flow, so you are pretty much redirecting all of the essential material to trying to get rid of waste. Further, the Astartes, and specifically the iliac kidney, would need to draw ions out of many other systems such as muscles, extracellular fluid, blood, and even organs. This would almost entirely stop their function. If you don't have calcium in your muscles cannot contract. It does, however, give the ability to remove waste, and let the iliac kidney retain these ions and at least much of the water that is in it. This will also ensure that any Astartes always has the capacity to increase water and salt retention. This should keep blood volume elevated while also allowing for removal of waste. The second gene seed organ transplanted is the neuroglottid. This is placed within the Astartes' upper nasal passages. The role it has is to basically analyze anything that goes into the mouth and is chewed on or smelt through the nose. This is said to allow it to biochemically test for toxicity and nutritional content, notably identifying if it can be eaten or if it is dangerous. The neuroglottoid is likely very similar, if not a latter part of the omophagia. That is, it links with the brain and central nervous system to better process data. That is, to tell the body what is either partly, outright poisonous, or dangerous from experience, or likely to be poison or dangerous from experience, and then on top of that, what is safe. The Astartes may be given a series of antibody-like structures for a range of known dangerous contents that are universal to them at least. This would be like someone with gluten allergies getting an upset stomach, but much earlier and without the unpleasant prayers to the porcelain god. By having antigen or antibody-like structures, they can detect even small amounts of a toxin or similar. This in turn means that they can identify the flavor or odor of danger. Similarly, antibodies to essential vitamins and minerals may also be produced. This means the Astartes can taste if the food or similar has good or bad content, and a rough estimate of each based on the response from their sensory neurons, or in this case, antibodies. The same organ's also supposed to allow the Space Marine to identify extremely subtle odors, and be on par with a dog. Specifically a tracking dog, but the exact breed's not so important. The increase in sensory neurons in the nose would make this much easier, and the more fidelity the senses have, the greater the ability to detect even small amounts of dangerous or desirable things it has. For that matter, much of what you would be tasting is actually going to be detected through a sense of smell anyway. So increasing the ability to detect odors would also increase the ability to taste things. In this case, the ability to both taste and smell small concentrations of a stimuli leads to a much easier identification. If the body is able to better synchronize the sense of danger with a small or trace amount of odor or flavor, it will more readily know the change or benefit of that thing and be able to track. The 16th gene seed organ implanted into the neophyte is the mucranoid. This is implanted within the central nervous system, but it will only respond to chemical stimuli from the environment. It allows the Astartes to create a waxy protein covering to their body that seals all their pores and skin. This is not a phenomenon so different to sweat as it is made by humans already. The body produces a wax or oil-like product called sebum from sebaceous glands. These are found alongside sweat glands in pores. They are able to protect the body from microbial threats by creating an inhospitable, acidic environment. The need for it to be primed is a question of practice and application. The gland's operation must first be activated by the chemical treatment applied to the skin. Usually this is done before the action itself is done. After the mucranoid gland is activated, the Astartes find themselves protected from all of the harshest environments they could find themselves in. This includes extremes of temperature and the vacuum of the void. As the Astartes can already slow down if not cease most biological and psychic activity, the priming process is likely one of ensuring the body can accommodate both the need to release a material and have already produced it and not see negative effects. As mentioned, the human body already makes a range of oils, waxes, and other content on the skin. You do not want interactions or chemical reactions from the mucranoid gland. This likely reduces production of other secretions, while allowing the mucranoid gland to produce the mucus-like material in mass. This is a preparation for then deployment when needed. Doing so would protect the user and prevent ruptures or other damage related to the same pores and glands still trying to release either their contents or similar when sealed. It is likely made from a range of proteins, not just to ensure the polymer-like effect, but also stability. In the void of space, it is extremely cold. Most waxes and oils would freeze and break. It would therefore be necessary to have protein to hold everything together in the extreme heat or cold or whatever environment this is used. It is sort of like what rebar does in concrete. As the neophyte turns 16 to 17, they will receive the Betcher's gland mentioned earlier. It is 2 glands implanted into different parts of the Astartes' mouth. Generally, it's going to be the lower lip and the salivatory glands. Other options include the hard palate. The glands work to make the saliva of the Astartes corrosive. Theoretically, it's going to cause them to be able to spit it out and attack anyone. The problem is that it's described as both corrosive and acidic. The question then is whether or not it's one or the other. In terms of acid, the stomach already makes this, but bile is corrosive, and if we were to look at it in those terms, it could be a practical replacement for the gallbladder and urinary bladder. That is, that it holds an inhospitable content, and if it is in practice closer to the stomach, that would be just as functional. It is a very thick layer of epithelium and a small volume, so that it can resist the corrosive effect when we talk about the Betcher's gland itself, and that the cells involved in the creation or the secretion of the content would likely be a modified version of goblet cells. These are what make hydrochloric acid for the stomach. You would need both the very thick layer of epithelium and the very controlled release for that reason. These implants have a common use in digesting difficult or impossible to consume things, for example cellulose, otherwise known as wood or paper. Some of the Primarchs are said to have basically created gene seed at the current time where the Betcher's gland no longer works. The use of a alkali or basic substance would make sense if we're talking about the role it might have with carbohydrates. That is, they will break down under the presence of amylases better if it is an alkali environment. The problem is the stomach. It will negate that effect entirely unless the Priomnor can work around the issue of extremely corrosive substances. The atrophy of the organ is a different issue and likely not a case of atrophy but mutation. The problem then would be how the Magus Biologists views this. If it is still genetically there but mutated such that it no longer produces a corrosive substance due to a misread or nonsense mutation, it can make a lot more sense. It could also be that the genes are all there but not a promoter to ensure activity. We see this regularly with lactose intolerance. The gene for lactase, or the enzyme that makes lactose consumable and useful, is defunct for a range of reasons, therefore it either does not work or it is not present at all. The same could be true of the chapters with an atrophied gland. The 18th gene seed organ implanted is the way an Astartes will pass on their legacy, as it is the means by which they will generate at least 2 or more gene seed. One is implanted in the neck and another in the chest. The organs will respond to the presence of other gene seeds implanted in the body, and by doing so they will, let's say, try and create a germ cell, although it's described as both being a germ cell and undergoing mitosis, which is an issue. The description is especially problematic because a cell either undergoes meiosis or mitosis, but not both. If it is a stem cell that is generated, then it would still be mitosis. This also seems the most likely explanation. The range of organs or organoids produced is extreme. If it is possible to make so many from a germ cell, it would be surprising. If instead it was a mitotic division of a very early stem cell, then yes, it could happen. It is also possible the apothecarian would need an early enough stem cell to repurpose it chemically to make all of the different organs. The mature progenoid organ can be removed and the new gene seed implanted, and this will allow them to be cultured and grow. This is also the only way that new implants can be created, so it is an issue, and why we mentioned that the very first thing you need is a veteran from which you can harvest gene seed. If this is, however, like bone marrow, the harvesting is one issue, but it would also mean that stem cells make more sense. Stem cells create the platelets, leukocytes, and erythrocytes, or red blood cells, from a common ancestor cell. These multiply and eventually populate the bone marrow. That then gives rise to the functional cells. The progenitor gland is said to be harvestable after 5 years, and that means that you can get the one in the neck very early on. However, the one in the chest is not ready until 10 years have passed. Both time frames are quite extreme, unless the progenitor gland is very slow growing. The other issue is the one in the chest will be very hard to access. A regular human can donate bone marrow after 2 years, although it's rare to have that happen. It means that every 24 months you could theoretically get a new harvest. If this is a similar level of stem cell production, let's say, but in a dedicated organ, it would be reasonable to imagine it would both be better, as in more concentrated and pure, while also being able to produce the required cells in a much shorter time frame. The progenitor gland should not need to worry about producing any cellular products, such as platelets, leukocytes, or erythrocytes. This means you should, at a minimum, be able to harvest it every 2 years. The last gene seed organ transplanted that the neophyte will receive before becoming an Astartes is, for all biological and procedural purposes, the black carapace. This is an interface of sort. It is described as a neuroactive system, where there is black organic fibrous material implanted directly under the skin of the neophyte's torso, Points are then cut through the carapace by an apothecary, and this allows the Astartes to directly interface between his armor and central nervous system. The theory is that within a few hours, the material will harden and basically create a solid connection point for neurons to grow inward interlink with the Astartes central nervous system. This is a crazy degree of growth, and it is theoretically possible with the current availability of technology. Even if the future technology allows for, let's say, more effective communication, it would still be necessary for the apothecary to develop a data set by which the Astartes would be able to interact with their power-armored suit in the future. That is, not every individual is going to have the same neurological signals telling their body what to do and how, in order to ensure that the power armor does not go against the Astartes' movements, thereby possibly causing injury, or worse yet, death in combat. They would need to have a data set that would tell the armor, this is what is meant by this signal. Prospectively, this is both collected throughout the neophyte's training and once the neuroreactive implant is completed. Without this, although it may not necessarily be required for the black carapace to work, it's likely to greatly reduce the combat efficacy of the Astartes. From here, the Astartes in making is going to be fitted for armor, weapons, and equipment, assuming they haven't already been elevated to the Scout Company. They will be preparing for combat deployment as one of the Battle Brothers within the 10th Company, or the Scout Company of their chapter. This is a place where they will learn from veteran Astartes the ways of the battlefield, how to not die, how to fight, how to engage with other chapters, and more. Since the neophyte was 14 and they received their catalepsian node, they have been receiving hypnotherapy training. Now, it is a rather large question as to what this means in terms of future technology, as at present, hypnotherapy does practically nothing and there's very little evidence to suggest otherwise. It is entirely possible that the knowledge they're gaining, particularly as it relates to muscle memories of all the processes they need, whether that is how to load or maintain their weapons, whether it is memorizing the Codex Astartes for the Smurfs, or if it is how to bend the rules of the Codex Astartes in the case of the Bloody Magpies. All of this is done through hypnotherapy. It is possible that the apothecarians may have some means of, let's say, interacting with their brain and, let's say, rewarding them. More specifically, it is going to be something that will stimulate pleasure centers of their brain when they've done the correct thing, and some sort of punishment part of their brain when they haven't. The actual means of this happening is very difficult to explain beyond simply saying space magic, or in this case, hypnotherapy. If they do use the means we've mentioned of encouraging brain activity and rewarding it, they could also use other methods, and that is what's going to lead to a child soldier on par with the special forces of today. Somebody who has spent years and years in the military, not necessarily in training. But this is how you get an Astartes. 1 of 1,000 in each chapter if they are Codex compliant. And now you need to repeat the process tens of thousands of times over to fill just the current ranks of the Adeptus Astartes. Ranks that are certainly not at full strength, nor are all chapters actively trying or able to replenish their ranks. Further to that, you have the abysmally high failure rate of aspirants and neophytes, let alone the attrition rate of veteran brothers in the battlefield who die without either being able to harvest their gene seed or having the gene seed destroyed. There are many ways in which this process could be cut short very quickly and very early on. This is the process to get from a 1 successful aspirant to 1 successful neophyte and then 1 successful battle brother. And at any point along the way, there could be a failure leading to the death of the neophyte or aspirant, therefore meaning there is no one to refill that missing part of the ranks of that chapter. And as mentioned, some chapters are simply unable to recruit, and then you have others that are less than compliant with the rules. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.